Okay. Hi everyone who's joining. Welcome to Governing Intimacies in Lockdown. Thanks very much for joining this afternoon. My name is Srila Roy, and I'm an associate professor of sociology at Wits University, where I lead this research project, which is called Governing Intimacies. The purpose of the project is really to facilitate research, collaborations, conversations in the global south, specifically between India and Southern Africa. It's just so surreal and wonderful to have the session we have today and the speakers we have here with us, because it's exactly almost to the day a year since we all met in Delhi for a two-day project meeting, which was hosted by our Indian partners, the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. Nandita, in fact, was an organizer of that very successful meeting, which obviously now feels like it was 100 years ago. And at that meeting, we had a panel where Durba and Nandita, who I will formally introduce to you in a minute, both spoke about, along with our colleagues from South Africa, they spoke about basically some of the issues we're going to talk about today. Body, space, touch, contact. But again, I mean, in this very short period of time, I mean, all of these issues have just resumed a whole different range of meanings and resonances. And I think it'd be also really interesting to hear from both of you what this means for you as researchers interested in, actually not just thinking through these questions, but doing the actual research. Okay, so just to introduce you more formally, Dr. Durba Chattaraj is an anthropologist who teaches and a writer who teaches, an anthropologist who teaches writing and a writer who teaches anthropology. I really like that, Durba. It actually suddenly makes like so much sense. At Ashoka University, she's the first director of writing, and she's been instrumental in setting up the writing programs at both undergraduate and postgraduate level. And she's also completing a book on highways in India, which is what she's going to talk about today. And we're very lucky in Governing Intimacies to support this important research and the completion of this book. So welcome, Durba. It's really lovely to see you. Nandita Dutta is a PhD candidate at University College London. Her research is looking at intimacy and pleasure in beauty salons in London, specifically looking at the experiences of first-generation migrant women from India and Pakistan. Before starting this PhD, which I think began, last September, Nandita, possibly, yes. She was working at the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexualities at Ashoka. And before that, she was a film journalist and is the author of the book F-Rated, Being a Woman Filmmaker in India, which was published by HarperCollins in 2019. And lovely to see you and have you here, Nandita. So I think for those of you who've been very, very kindly joining our sessions, you know what the format is like. Each of the speakers will speak to our theme today, which is bodies and space, for about 10 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for them to kind of speak to each other, moderated by myself, and then we'll open up to your questions, comments, thoughts, which will be moderated by my colleague, Caio Arujo, who's a part of Governing Intimacies and is curating the series with me. Please feel free to introduce yourselves using the chat function. And please also use the Q&A button to ask your questions. So yeah, thanks again. It's just really great that every time we do these webinars bi-weekly, and we have just a great crowd. So thank you so much. Durba, would you like to start?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Srila. Thank you, Caio. Thank you, Nandita. Thank you so much to the Governing Intimacies Project and to the audience who joined us today. I'm afraid I'm going to read because I lose track of my thoughts much more on Zoom than I do in any other medium. So I hope it's not too looking down and reading, but I hope that you get something out of the piece. All right, I'm just going to start. In response to the coronavirus pandemic, on March 24th, 2020, the government of India ordered a nationwide lockdown of 1.3 billion Indians which was then extended in a graded fashion until May 31st. In fact, it wasn't until June 8th that what was called Unlock 1.0 began. The day after the lockdown was declared, what was termed a migrant exodus in the press began to take place. Since all transportation was locked down, migrant workers began to walk along India's highways, leaving cities on foot, on bicycles, on rickshaws, on carts designed for differently abled people to return to hometowns or villages. In 2020, India witnessed one of the largest mass migrations since the partition of the country into India and Pakistan. If one includes the special labor or shramik trains that were eventually introduced by the government to aid in this migration after that initial highway walking exodus, it is estimated that over 5 million people eventually made it home in response to the lockdown and its continuing economic fallout, which continues to this day. Between 2006 and 2008, I conducted 18 months of ethnographic research along highways in India, at a moment when speed and connectivity were being celebrated in the nation. The Mellon Foundation's Governing Intimacies project helped me to reconceptualize this project through the lens of intimacy. Intimacy in the writing, intimacy in the methodology, and intimacy indeed in the claims being made. In fact, the tentative title for my soon-to-be-completed book, hopefully very soon, is Roadscapes, an Intimate Economy of Post-Liberalization India. During my fieldwork decade, which many have termed the India shining moment in India's economic growth and global aspirations, the overarching vision for India's highways was that of uninterrupted high-speed connectivity, where bodies themselves were mostly seen as hindrances. In a nutshell, bodies were seen to not belong on highways unless they were encased in vehicles. Cut to 2020, and we witness a moment of brutal and oftentimes barefoot, literally barefoot exodus. Vehicles are locked down and bodies dramatically reclaim highways because of a pandemic that is intimately tied to the movements generated by global capital. As and when we return to some form of normal, this exodus may be forgotten or may be seen as a blip, a temporary aberration in capital's accelerated trajectories in India. The last chapter of my book attempts to write against this possible forgetting, to present an intimate account of this moment, inspired by the poetic methodology of the writer and Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich. Now, in addition to my book project, Governing Intimacies funded internships at Ashoka Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality, and a brilliant intern I worked with, Hiteshi Ajmera, at Ashoka looked at close to 100 journalistic and YouTube sources, translating across 3 languages regarding the migrant crisis as it was happening. She culled the words of migrant workers, layering direct quotations one after the other, fully cited, but with minimal mediation from journalistic or anthropological commentators in her writing. I read from Hiteshi's compendium, and this is just an excerpt. And the first thing I'm reading is a song that she translated, and then I'll keep reading until I say that I'm not reading direct quotations in translation from workers themselves. Send us workers to our home, Sarkar. My home and family are missing me. It is out of dire necessity that we have to be laborers, leave our homes and families and wander in cities. The ones who got us here have abandoned us midstream. Do something, Sarkar. We did not know that we would see such days, where because of the corona, people are hidden in their homes. We only endure this torture because of the sinful stomach. Do something, Sarkar. My house is silent in the wake of my absence. Send us home, Sarkar. And obviously this doesn't capture what this would sound like as a song, right? The intimacies of song itself. Walking for a week, coming from Haryana, going to Aligarh, don't have food, have 4 kids, don't have rent. They beat us, didn't get paid. I just want to go home. We will walk till our homes in Bihar. Our homes are approximately 1,300 kilometers away. We tried to book online, but they canceled our trains. We will go home on foot to any side of the road. I'm from Ayodhya. I've been stuck here ever since lockdown started. There were lots of difficulties. I have nothing to eat. There is no work either. That's why I started walking towards home. We are very worried about the lockdown. I can't even get milk for my daughter. When they don't get milk for even one day, they say, "Mommy, I want milk." Where do I get her milk from? I had big dreams for my daughter to study and educate her more than me. So she is successful, but that has not come true. We have made this country, but now they kick us in the stomach. So it's sort of this compendium of quotes, 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 which is like, many, many pages long. I have to figure out what to do in its final iteration. Is a methodology to bring this all together, right? So now I'm not quoting anymore. The migrant worker crisis, as it became termed, became both a humanitarian as well as a public relations crisis for the central as well as state governments. Many hasty measures were made to manage the fallout, from the allocation of special Shramik Express trains to transport workers home, to the distribution of food grains, to the creation of a USD 23 billion welfare fund, to the jailing, beating, or mass corralling of workers on the move in many cases. A question one can ask here is how we got to this situation when there is a rich and long-standing body of research that looks at the nature of informal labor in India, the nature of circular migration in the country, and the precarity of many, but not all, migrant workers in Indian cities. Figures long in circulation have put the numbers of India's migrant workers in the range of 100 million plus. How is it then that policymakers did not put 2 and 2 or 100 million plus precarity together and better anticipate the effects that a total lockdown may have on the urban informal workforce? Were these figures just, in effect, numbers without bodies, statistics circulated and received with little understanding of the intimate, affective human lives that made up these massive cumulative figures? Could it be that in India today, in central and powerful policy-making circles at least, there is a certain problem of data without intimacy, of statistics so powerfully abstracted from the human lives they purport to describe that there's not just a gap, that gap always exists, between the thin simplifications, as James Scott might put it, of the state and quote-unquote on-the-ground reality, but rather a gaping, unbridgeable chasm. Numbers fail and repeatedly to translate to anything close to intimate, bodily, or even narrative understandings of human experience in the country. I turned to two policy experts with over a decade of experience in the Indian public policy realm to speculate as to how lockdown decisions may have been taken and the imaginaries that may have fueled them. For me, the rubric of intimacies can allow for such grounded speculative thinking, in addition to that which exists on the ground. Intimacy invites imagination. From this interview with the policy expert, I refuse to believe that that is the question of migrants, didn't cross their mind at all. Of course, it came up immediately after the communication of the lockdown. These are a very small set of people making decisions, and the imagination may have been of urban populations as mainly middle-class workers and the poor situated mostly in villages. Gujarat maybe. Off the record, I would say that nuanced thinking did not happen, and it was a panic situation. The mobile body, the migrant body, represents being state. Sometimes it is seen as if it is just the body, but it carries with it so much: ideas, cultures, beliefs. Mobility needs to not just be accepted, but embraced as central to India. They further said, I'm skeptical about having this decision from the perspective solely of numbers. They can be twisted in any which way. How then to make numbers more intimate? To make them speak more of the lives which they claim to accumulate? I will end with a provocation, perhaps. Just before this talk, I was looking at the Noor, a classic and also problematic ethnography by Evans Pritchard. I could have done the same with an ethnography by Zohar Neale Hurston or any of the classic ethnographers. There are very few numbers in the book. In fact, there is little numerical data between that which EP himself collected. Yet it is fairly unthinkable for an anthropologist or sociologist in the contemporary world to not have some statistics related to their field with some form of quantitative accounting of it. For example, I can't write about informality in India without knowing that our workforce is about 90%, without knowing something about NSS, National Sample Survey data, etc. It's just unthinkable, right? And this is by and large a good thing. But perhaps an intimate lens demands a movement the other way, and a powerful and concerted and collective one. Should quantitative accounts be asked to include more that is qualitative, more that is intimate, more that is concerned with lives, bodies, and affect? If not, why? And if yes, what might this look like in the realm of public policy making, for example, in India? A specific example, in a report that centers on data about 100 million migrant workers in the country, how many personal narratives, biographies, and open-ended interviews would work to make this a somewhat intimate account, rather than just a data-driven one? What is the best sample size, the correct N for intimacy? In the light of 2020's continuing and unabating crisis, is it possible that greater intimacy in policy might make it a step more effective or a step more humane? Thanks. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Durba. Nandita?
Yeah, thank you, Durba. I think that was a very powerful presentation, lots to think about. So as Srila mentioned, my research looks at intimacy and pleasure in beauty salons in London with respect to first-generation migrant women from India and Pakistan. In the interest of time and also to stick to the topic of this panel, I will leave out pleasure and focus only on intimacy, especially looking at intimacy in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, it's very interesting to me that the only two contexts in which we have heard intimacy being discussed about in the context of the pandemic are, one, intimacy as sex. So almost every kind of media outlet was publishing, a guide to intimacy during the pandemic. And then the other, obviously, is intimate partner violence. So that is something which was discussed at length in the first session of Governing Intimacies webinars. So I won't dwell much on it. But what I want to say here is that it was very clear that even in the response to the pandemic, the home was being kind of centered or privileged as the proper domain of intimacy, with focus obviously on the nuclear heterosexual family as the unit of intimacy. So given all this background, how do you then situate the... And I think here a statement by the mayor of an Italian town was very telling. So during the early days of the virus, in a video where he was urging, this mayor called Morena Martini, he was urging people to stay at home, and he said, and I quote here, "Something that drove me crazy is people secretly going to the hairdresser and beauty salons. Great, you will die with your hair combed and nicely waxed, but you will die." So the beauty salon, obviously, her imagination is construed as a feminine, hence a space of frivolity and vanity. But what happened in the wake of the pandemic is that it also became a space of risk and contagion, because as you all know, all beauty and hair services necessitate close touch and close contact. So I wanted to look at the meaning-making practices of women of these salons. So how do women who work in these salons and who use these salons make sense of what. And in this presentation, I'm focusing on one specific salon in Southwest London, which we will call Noor's Hair and Beauty. So this place is owned and run by Noor, a woman in her 40s who got married and moved to the UK about 20 years ago. She lives in London with her husband and 3 kids, and she's also a practicing Muslim. So as part of my ethnographic research, I have been working as an assistant to Noor since January this year. And I have previously... actually working as a beauty assistant with her. So one day in a casual conversation, I asked her that, what does the salon mean to you? And she said, and I quote, "It's my home of a kind. I'm happy to come here. It feels like home." Like home, I repeated. "Like you feel nice to be home after work? Same way I feel good here. It doesn't seem like a burden," she said. "But at home, you have 100 responsibilities." "Yes, like kids," she said. "But here, I'm alone. Sometimes when I'm here, I tell my husband I'm working, but I'm actually not working. Like half an hour, quarter hour, I do whatever I feel like doing. Sometimes I just sit silently. I do whatever I feel like doing here." End of quote. So this is Noor, who obviously owns and manages the place, and she's also the chief hairdresser and beautician at the salon. On the client side, there's one specific woman I'll talk about. So let's... And Tasneem lives a few houses away from the salon, and she moved back in with her parents after her husband of 20 years died. And as a widow, her mobility is strictly monitored by her younger brother and her mother. So Tasneem told me that the only 2 places her family didn't mind her visiting were the local library and the beauty salon. And as I observed her more and more, it became increasingly clear to me that Tasneem wasn't coming to Noor's hair and beauty for purely fun. While she got her eyebrows, upper lips, and cheeks waxed, she traded stories about the members of her family. She joked, laughed, and recited poetry. Although she paid full price for the services that she availed, she never came to the salon empty handed. She brought bowls of mutton nihari or biryani as though she were visiting a friend. So the beauty salon was a place of sociality for her, the only one she was allowed, on account of being an all female space run by an equally pious Pakistan. She saw Noor as a friend, the only one she had, she will later confide in me. So, hairdressers and beauty salons are a site of both physical and emotional intimacy for women, in that women not only assent to being touched intimately, but also talk their hearts out, share details of their personal lives, and sometimes even seek advice. So, while looking at the work that beauticians and hairdressers do, I'm using the analytical concept of intimate labor, which is by Raquel Pareñas and Eileen Boris. And intimate labor, the way I'm defining it, to me it means both body work, which is work performed on someone's body, as well as emotional labor. Moving on, I'll just give a very quick timeline of how beauty salons were affected here in the UK by the lockdown. So beauty salons were asked to close on March 23rd, which was a complete lockdown. All the businesses had to shut down. And then they were allowed to reopen on July, but on the condition that they will not offer any services that involve work in the high-risk zone. So what I want you to note from this is that eyebrow threading was considered a high-risk activity, and it wasn't allowed until August 15, which was about a month after salons had reopened. So I can indeed confirm from my field notes that the week before the lockdown, women were flocking to the salon, and most of them to get their eyebrows and upper lips threaded. Now, this was a time when touch had already been stigmatized. The government's messaging at this point was very clear about, washing your hands, sanitizing your hands constantly, and not touching your face. So, not very far off from the Italian mayor's statement, I do have a record in my field notes of one woman saying, "If I'm going to die of coronavirus, might as well die with my eyebrows shaved." And I must also admit at this point, I was actually shocked to find this in my field notes. Eyebrows shaved on March 15. And this was a time when I was obsessively washing my hands and trying not to touch my face. But like all these other women, I did not think twice about the risk involved in Noor touching my face. Now, this is something you cannot make sense of if you take a very narrow view of the beauty salon. So, of course, we love our eyebrows. But in order to understand why women trust the beautician or their hairdresser to such an extent that their touch does not strike them as risky, dangerous, we have to understand the beauty salon as a highly intimate space of touch, of emotional closeness, and of trust. So somebody you trust enough to touch you in intimate parts of your body, and I'm thinking of, say, bikini waxing here. Somebody you trust enough to share your most personal secrets with, so that somebody doesn't strike you as a potential carrier of contagion. And that also challenges our ideas about the domestic sphere being the only intimacy is possible. What I'm trying to say here is that touch and space also kind of co-constitute each other. So not only is a certain type of touch only allowed at home, it is also home becomes what it means to us because of a certain kind of touch. And you see exactly that intimate touch, that physical and emotional intimacy being replicated in the salon, which is why I think there's just a trust that is a byproduct of it, which you cannot quite understand if you just looked at a beauty salon as only beauty treatments happen. Now, going against official regulations, Noor also started threading eyebrows as soon as the salon reopened. And not surprisingly, the day the salon reopened, Tasneem was the first client to walk in to get her face waxed and threaded, but most urgently to talk about all that had transpired in her life since the lockdown. I also have to say here that the first couple of weeks after the salon reopened were filled with anxiety for me because I was shocked that Noor was offering services at risk. And her rationalization for it was that these were her friends, not clients, friends who paid for the services. So what struck me as particularly interesting was Noor's boundary work, to use Michel Lamont's term, to determine who was a friend and who was not, In other words, who was she willing to touch or comfortable touching, and who was to be excluded from her touch? And here comes a very uncomfortable observation. So the one who was excluded from her touch, other, the black woman. So while Noor would take on her regular clients for eyebrow threading, no questions asked, and most of these regular clients were, well, predominantly brown and some white, whenever a new client walked into the salon and asked for eyebrow threading, the outcome really depended on the color of his skin. So, for instance, there were times when there would be two clients seated next to each other, one a friend whose eyebrows were being threaded, and the other a black woman whose eyebrows were being waxed because waxing required an intimate contact. So to put this into perspective, actually this provided continuity. This wasn't a break from what was going on in the salon before the pandemic. The production and reproduction of Noor's hair and beauty as a space of sociality and intimacy for South Asian women was predicated on the exclusion of the racial other. For instance, what would bring religious South Asian women back to the salon were, as repeat clients, was a complimentary blow dry thrown in with haircut, or positive conversations around religion. Very few Black women actually came back to the salon because their first experience wasn't very pleasant. And on Noor's side, they were instantly stereotyped as rude and angry. So the pandemic just became an excuse to reinforce the boundaries of race and ethnicity, which manifested also in touch. To conclude, I think the question that I'm definitely interested in asking is that how does intimacy deal with difference? Or is it all that to create an intimate space for someone, it needs to be predicated on the exclusion of the other that must remain outside the fold. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nandita. And I mean, yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what Durba thinks precisely about that question, because I think listening to Durba, the tension or this provocation about data, or the abstract nature of data and the coldness of hard stats as against intimate human interest stories, for instance, I mean, makes me think precisely, I think, what Nandita's reflections around the space of the beauty salon, a space of an intimate space which is differentially produced, right, in terms of the bodies that actually inhabit the space, makes me think of how that's precisely what's also happening in terms of the more macro settings in terms of which human interest stories, to put it more bluntly, which human interest stories grabs the Indian public, right? So the point is not that I think that it's not just that there's a problem with stories being reduced to data, but the fact is whose stories. So if we think of this and for our primarily Indian audience today, what's happening around the death of a recent actor, the way in which the Indian media is presenting that story as against what obviously we were saying before around the migrants. I mean, it's just so stark in the way in which obviously the media is producing a particular an intimacy in a certain way. So I suppose what I'm thinking is precisely what I think Nandita is thinking too, is that that there isn't an absence of different scales at which we tell these stories, whether they're very everyday, whether they're very intimate, whether they're extraordinary, but it's who they attach to, right? Which bodies they attach to. So yeah, that would be interesting, I think, for Durba to reflect on. And Nandita, I think it would be really interesting for you to perhaps reflect on, thinking back to our conversation in Delhi about how your project, or now you were looking at beauty salons there in Delhi, and you were working as a beauty assistant there as well, and now you're doing it in London. And yeah, I think it would be really interesting to hear what, how that's been different or how that's been similar. But I did also really just want to thank you for bringing the racial politics into play, because we've had a number of conversations recently about racism amongst South Asians. And I see, Amrita Ghosh is in our audience today, and she curated a wonderful webinar with some colleagues talking precisely about this and about colorism, about racism, and I think that's obviously so unspoken. So I think that I'm just grateful that you're bringing it back on the table, and maybe you want to reflect on it a little bit more. So yeah, let's just have a couple more reflections from both of you, and then we'll open up to Q&A.
You should go first. Nandita, do you want to go first this time?
No, I'll take a while to just think about the questions.
No, so then I'll go. Srila, thank you. That was a really good question, and I think very in line with sort of what's going on in the Indian media space today. So for those of you who don't know, a young actor in India recently committed suicide, which is a great tragedy, and that's led to sort of an endless cycle of news in the middle of the pandemic, while all kinds of other stories are ignored. So definitely what human interest story makes it to the news is one question. But interestingly, the migrant story did make it to the news cycle. So it was sort of, the migrant humanist interest story made it to the news cycles again and again and again for quite a while, for a few months at least, of course, until the Shramik train started and that very dramatic image of, the child, the 11-year-old child who cycled and took her parents. I mean, it was story after story after story that even the most sort of, anti-labor and pro sort of celebrity news channel couldn't quite ignore. So for a while, the human interest stories were dominated by these migrant stories. And in fact, the thing that Nandita points to, that you also point to, Srila, who's excluded in human interest stories at any scale also becomes very important. So sort of there became this, I don't know quite what the word is. I think that one of the policy experts I talked to really coined it well and will come up with it. But really, states started pitting against each other about whose migrants they were. So Delhi is treating Bihari migrants badly, send our migrants back to us. There was no longer the Indian migrant. You have sent my migrants my dead migrants in the same truck as living migrants. How could you do this? So state ministers got involved, people from different states got involved. So there was this increasing othering in the idea of the homogenous Indian migrant. And that continues to this day. So sort of, how solutions are also coming up to this problem are very state-based, are very localized. Some states have done a much better job. So Kerala, for example, has done a much better job than other states in terms of who it allows to, not just receive its services, but who is considered a resident of the state. In fact, Kerala didn't use the term migrant worker, it used resident worker, guest worker, and had a huge campaign around this. But the one thing I want to say is that the human interest stories in the media and in government reports are quite different. And in fact, if you read report after report, you will see, and I do, writing workshops of all things with policy professionals, and you see this extreme and sometimes really staggering disconnect between data that is cumulative about any realm and between what is actually happening that human beings are doing on the ground. And I've been thinking about why this is, but there is some kind of massive disconnect between the two, to the point where, what ended up happening with the migrant crisis should have been something that people could predict, if for nothing else to prevent the kind of public relations disaster that happened when 16 migrants were mowed down by a train, right, while walking home, and all of them died, and their blood-spattered roti was sort of left on the tracks. Whether you're a government that cares about workers or whether you're a government that doesn't, you don't want these kinds of stories to happen. And so what happens if we know that these figures are out there, but we can't predict something like this taking place when there's a total draconian 1.3 billion lockdown? It's a bit staggering. It's kind of strange that it happened, I would say. Yeah.
So about the two questions you asked me, Srila, I think they're very, very important. And what is the similarity between the beauty salon I was working in India at and the one I'm working in here? I think the beauty industry in both the places is seen as, there are low barriers to entry, but that's also because these are largely considered kind of low-skilled professions, which also pay very badly and most often than not have very exploitative working conditions. And in India, I found, and that was a bit of a surprise to me, that basically the low status of was grounded in caste, because most of the workers there also were formerly barbers, and barbers are a low caste profession. And now they have kind of segued into beauty salons. And by association, the beauty profession is also considered low in status. In the UK, at least where in the neighborhood where I live at, I feel like most of the people who work as beauticians or hairdressers in the salons are migrants. And so that is kind of the difference. And at the same time, what is similar, that, it is still considered a low skilled profession and which pays badly. And while in India, it's dominated by lower caste people, here it's mostly migrants in these professions. About the race thing, actually, it made me very uncomfortable at first because, my whole idea wanted to break the stereotype of dependent female migrant. So women from India and Pakistan who don't come here on work visas, who come here essentially because they get married and travel with their husbands. So the idea was to somehow dismantle the stereotype of them being as very passive, as them not participating in the workforce, participating in public life. And then suddenly, as I started spending more and more time in the salon, the racism became to me. And how to write about it was also something which was a bit of a challenge, because I feel like when you're talking about racism, there's also like so you always talk about the white gaze to difference, and you don't talk so much about how migrants amongst themselves view each other. And that to me became very interesting because I would hear things being said not only about Black women but also about. So that is another constituency that I think dominates the beauty profession. And the whole idea is that, the beauty profession used to be somehow better and well-paying before all these Eastern Europeans came in. So I think that also to me became very interesting as to how migrant communities view each other. So it doesn't always have to be, you don't always have to kind of focus on the wide gaze towards difference. And I think that is something that I will try to do in my project.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, in fact, it actually made me think about how much, well, within things that you've been reading about this kind of embodied forms of labor, whether, these very much more localized politics around race and ethnicity are in fact foregrounded. And if they're not, I think this presents a real opportunity, quite an important one, I would think, to talk about it. Kayo, shall we open up to questions? And you might have your own comments, so feel free.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the two very, very exciting presentations. I'll start with the few questions that we have here in the Q&A, and you can reply to that, and then I also have a set of questions that I can ask later. I think the questions that we receive, they are all connected to a particular issue, which is the body is not a universal construct, right? The body is always qualified in very different terms. So I think these questions that we receive, they point a little bit to what are the kinds of intersectionality and what are the kinds of social meanings that are ascribed to those bodies. So for example, our colleague here, Nehama Brody, is asking about the gendered construction of the body in terms of the narratives about the migrant exodus in India. And is there a difference in the ways in which the male and the female bodies inhabit this space and the ways in which they are moving in this context? And then also relating to this, Debjyoti Ghosh from the University of Pretoria, he's asking if in your case, Durba, do you find that there is some sort of regional racialization at play, again, in the Indian context? If there are particular types of migrants in terms of their descriptions and their portrayal, if that can be interpreted as a form of racialization within the migrant politics in India. And secondly, a question for Nandita in terms of, if you could elaborate a little bit on the question of the white clientele in Noor Salon and what are the particular issues that raises in terms of the questions that you raised. I would be very interested to know, and that is my own addition to the question, if there is a different politics of touch in relation to the white body, if you can explore that. And I think you can answer that, and then we can collect a few more questions.
Durba?
Thank you for these questions. I'll take the second one first in terms of the regional racialization of particular types of migrants. Absolutely. So India has had a long racialized and racist rhetoric. I mean, most Indian cities against people from the Northeast, and that in conjunction with the coronavirus pandemic led to extremely violent racist attacks on people who were seen to be an obviously racialized other. So that was there was a spate of incidents like this which were brutal and quite unrelenting, and probably continue to this day. And this is sort of an exacerbation of a long-standing problem in Indian cities. But in addition to that, there was regional racialization along all kinds of lines, sort of ideas of your source state, of being a Bihari versus a Bengali versus a Northeastern versus a South Indian migrant became very, very important. And it was and it continues to be. So sort of, even states, their own responses to people who are migrants and people who are residents of the states are also becoming differentiated along different lines. You actually see panic situations along borders where people are being allowed to leave one state to go, but they're not being allowed to enter their state, right? And in this game, some states are seen as being good to their workers, such as Bihar, wanted their workers back, treated them well. Some states are seen as being good to migrants, such as Kerala, where they treated their migrant workers well. And some states are seen as being very antithetical and hostile to their own workers returning. So this idea of who's your own worker, who's not. So workers returning from Delhi to Uttar Pradesh were seen as having a really draconian response from the UP government, who's meant to protect them as our state government. So all of these regional identities became really, really important, including various types of racial identities and forms of discrimination. In terms of, the gender construction of the body as it moves through space, absolutely. There were many, many differences in how migrants were portrayed in the media. There haven't been so far very differentiated responses in terms of the state response. So there hasn't been a particular, at least at the central government, set of package towards female bodies versus male bodies, right? But in terms of how the media portrayed them, definitely would see women as sort of, traveling with families and needing to sort of provide with the idea of motherhood, the idea of starving children. So that was one trope. But what was quite interesting is that because people were leaving home, they were leaving with children, men and women were leaving with their children. And so the vulnerability that parents who could not provide for their children displayed was sort of presented to the nation across gender lines. So sort of there were men who were crying. One of the clips that went viral was a 14-year-old boy who was crying because he was just completely desperate and, had absolutely no way to sort of, either figure out where to go or how to keep body and soul together. And so there was a kind of maybe an admission or a viewing of vulnerability on the part of male workers, male construction workers, which maybe was quite unusual in the Indian media space at any rate. I mean, it's not something that's often shown. And it was tremendously moving to a lot of people in the country.
Again, a very interesting point in terms of if there's a different politics of touch when it comes to white bodies. And I can only provide anecdotal evidence as of now because I'm quite early in my research. So the stereotype of the white client is as appreciative and generous. And this is something that I've seen, that even if they come for, say, threading, which costs a tip of £1 or £2. So usually the visit of white clients is really looked forward to because while the white client will always tip generously, it's a South Asian client that bargains. So there are these very amusing conversations that happen that how much does a haircut cost? £10. Do it for £8. And then intense negotiations will follow for the next 15 minutes. And then Noor gets really upset. She's like, these people, all value our skills. They think anyone can do a haircut. And actually, that is the case. I've had women come in and saying, oh, you're just sitting idle. Like, you just have to take your scissors and cut my hair. What does it take? Why will you charge me so much money for that? So, this is very interesting dynamic, which plays out very differently with white clients vis-a-vis South Asian and Black clients. So yeah, white bodies or white clients are usually looked forward to, unless now when it comes to bikini waxing. So then the notions of purity, impurity, cleanliness come into play, because South Asians are cleaner because we wash, and white women are dirtier because they use tissue. So when it comes to, it's TMI here, but that's my research. So when it comes to touching private parts, I think beauticians are more comfortable touching South Asian women, because there's this notion that and white women are somehow not clean in their private areas. So again, I think there's a different layer of politics that happens in the beauty salon with regards to touch and bodies, and there are things that I'm just beginning to discover.
Okay, so we have a few other questions, very interesting ones. The first one is for Nandita. It's from Sidra Kamran from the New School of Social Research. She also did research on beauty salons in Karachi, Pakistan, and found similar dynamics as the ones you described in terms of the racial dynamics. However, she mentions that the salons that she was looking at, they were not always experienced as intimate spaces. And she says that in relation to the differences, for example, between high-end salons or local neighborhood salons, which are run by very different people for very different purposes. So she's asking if you have seen differences in terms of the level of intimacy across different spaces. And I think here the point she raises about class and about the economics of the salon itself are very interesting. And that takes us to another question also for Nandita, from Rachel O'Neill, which is about this nature of the salon as a commercial enterprise. So how do we articulate this very ambivalent venture, which is at the same time a very intimate space, but also a commercial space? So if you can say a little bit about if there is something as a commercial intimacy taking place here. Yeah. The other question for Durba from Nishan, which mentions that a certain solicitor in the Supreme Court criticized Indian journalists for the graphic way in which they covered the recent migrant crisis. So the question is, I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the relationship between visuality and intimacy. And to this question, I'm going to add something that I was wondering, because I think also Nandita's response to the previous question touched a little bit on the body as something that has to do with physicality. So it's very difficult to talk about the body socially without thinking about what this physicality of the body means. And in terms of the migrant exodus in India, I cannot imagine a situation that is experienced in a more physical way. We are actually talking about bodies that are walking for going through extremely harsh conditions. And I wonder if in the kind of portrayals you have looked at, if this kind of physical dimension is something that comes up, and in which ways. I would be very interested to know if there is a sense of tragedy, or even the sheer violence and brutality that the situation inflicts on bodies. So I think you can reply to that.
So I'll go first. So in response to Sidra, I think absolutely you're very, very right in that. So Noor's Hair and Beauty is very typical of a neighborhood salon, and which is why I think it's possible to conceptualize it as this very intimate space. Obviously now on the other end of the spectrum are these very highly salons, where, there's not so much. In fact, these are places where I felt where touch isn't even encouraged outside of the service, and nor is emotional intimacy. Like the clients are trained to just engage in a very professional chit chat, but not go very personal. There are very different rules with regards to professionalism. You don't talk about. I think there's research done by Sharma and Black in early 2000s, and where they looked at kind of higher end salons in the UK. That you don't talk about religion, politics, sex. And I feel like in the neighborhood salon, like the one I work at, these are precisely the things that you talk about, even with a client who comes in for the first time. So I think neighborhood salon is much more a space of intimacy than those higher end professional salons, where both kind of physical and emotional intimacy are very, very confined by rules of professionalism. To respond to Rachel's question, I think, so I didn't have the time for it, what friendships in the space of the salon mean. And here I think what's very helpful is to look at the idea of commercial friendships, which by Linda Price and Eric Arnold. So the friendships that happen, or the so-called friendships in the space of the salon, they have all the qualities of a friendship, so such as trust, loyalty, intimacy, self-disclosure, but they're bounded by commerce and context, which means that most often than not, the friendships don't really exist outside the salon. So whatever happens inside the space remains inside the space. And these friendships, in my experience, aren't even reciprocal, because it's always the client who considers the beautician a friend, but not the other way around. For the beautician, it's still a very professional relationship where they're acting like friends, but they don't think of their clients as their friends. So I think here, kind of the idea of bounded intimacy, of commercial intimacy is very, very important. And I'm definitely thinking in that direction. That's it.
So thank you for these questions. So with regards to the vultures question, so a lawyer representing the government of India actually said in the Supreme Court that the media that kept reporting on these quote-unquote migrant worker stories were like vultures, not helping, not assisting, just sort of, sweeping in for the kill to take picture after picture of human suffering. He actually mischaracterized, I think it was a South African photographer's own history and story with a picture of a child starving during a famine in Ethiopia, and that went around. But anyway, I won't get into that story because it'll take forever. But he claimed that basically the journalists were covering this crisis like vultures. And, there's some merit to that, because what are we meant to do with visions and images of extreme human suffering? Should we take pictures? Should we broadcast them? Should we look away? Are we being prurient when we stare? Are we being callous when we look away? And there's no easy answer to that question. So, but the one thing that was very strange about that representation was that in that same representation, the lawyer said that there were no migrant workers on the street. And there just were. So there was this, clear, sort of speaking of a disconnect between numbers and sort of, lived realities, at a moment where you could see representation after representation, unless these were all supposedly fictional, of workers still on the streets. They were making a claim in a court in the country that there were no workers. So there is a very strange disconnect between the two. That said, this connects to the question that you're asking about the visuality, the physicality of the body. Some of the coverage was very disturbing. Seeing pictures and seeing images and seeing film of just human suffering shorn of any form of, I don't know how to put it, but there are no barriers between you and sort of what the screen is showing again and again and again. So sort of children who are not, research ethics, right? If you're interviewing an 11-year-old child, what are the ethics to presenting that to the entire nation? You would have a lot of things as anthropologists and sociologists would have to think about, but a journalist doesn't necessarily have to. So there was something that it was a show that those of us who are comfortable enough to be in our homes were watching, and yet we could not look away. But at the same time, there was something about the intensity, the physicality of the suffering that made people stand up and pay attention to a population that had been invisibilized, right? By the state in various ways because of its discomfort with mobile and migrant bodies, by construction companies which don't even routinely build migrant housing, worker housing, even though they're meant to, right? So this was an invisibilized population that became extremely visible, and the conditions under which they existed, the precarity that some of them existed, became very visible. But yes, there was suffering, violence, brutality that you could see, but there were also these stories of the triumph of the body that were quite interesting. So these became very viral. The 11-year-old who could, bike her parents back to her village over 1,200 kilometers, a person who didn't have arms, or didn't have feet, who was able to wheel himself back to his village. These stories became these kind of triumph of the human spirit stories, and that was also taken up by the government in its own sort of slightly propagandist mode to say, look at our Indian workers, they're so great, they're capable of suffering so much, and they are able to do so much for the country. Isn't this great? Aren't we a great country? So it's very, both the triumphant narrative and the suffering narrative are problematic, and there isn't a clear answer as to what to do with suffering. But I think in this case, ignoring it would be worse than just presenting it. And it was, for some months, migrant workers became the forefront of what was talked about in the country, and that had not happened before in that way. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of other questions which are related to the issue of empathy. So I'm just going to read. So Durba Mitra is asking, and I'm reading, I wonder if you both might reflect on the question of empathy in the time of the virus. Do you see the narrative of suffering or the idea of hardship actually changing how people interact or engage with one another? So, for example, so in the case of Durba, the human interest stories of migrants, are they actually creating any significant change? And in the case of Nandita, if you have seen expressions of support coming from clients in this time of the pandemic, also demonstrating empathy. And to those questions, our colleague Nehama put another one, which is for both of you. And I'm reading again. In your capacity as writers, will these moments of empathy and arrested or constrained intimacy change how people will write about Indian society in the future, you think? Thank you. Who wants to go first?
I'm kind of trying to think about empathy and in that context in the pandemic, because I always found the salon as a space of empathy, where, people were discussing each other's problems, offering each other advice. So I don't think there has been a major shift in terms of it becoming a more empathetic space. It was always an empathetic space, is what I mean to say. With regards to Nikama's question, I think it's a very big question. I need to think about it. Maybe Durba can go till then.
Both amazing questions. They've given us a pause to think and a ready answer, which is, all of these questions have been great. About the, empathy and the time of the virus, and have these stories of migrants led to any changes? Yeah, in a very concrete sense, I would say yes. So you could almost, if you plan a timeline of the government responses to the aid packages that were created, or the Shramik Express trains, these trains that were made specifically to transport migrants home in the middle even of a graded lockdown. These were directly in response to some of the media coverage, right? And also advocacy on the part of various NGOs and various organizations that took this center stage. So yes, there was a certain shift, I think. But at the same time, empathy always creates a problem. And there's a wonderful book about Delhi called Maximum City. And there's this one scene where the writer takes the owner of a large corporation to a quote unquote slum where his workers live. And he sees, in front of him, in front of his eyes, all the terrible conditions and the suffering and the difficulty and the open drains and all of that. And then, he's kind of questioned about how what he feels after that. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit and probably butchering. But he says, I thought I would feel sympathy. I think he uses the word sympathy, but actually what I feel is contempt. So, the idea that just showing what's happening on the ground in some empathetic way will necessarily lead to an appropriate response from the state and from, society, it's a very, it's not guaranteed. It could lead to the other, right? And in this particular case, for this particular moment, we can be a bit hopeful that certain local level, state level, and central responses have tried to deal with this problem, which was to this point invisibilized. But does it necessarily lead to that? Not at all. I mean, it could lead to the idea of, if we get to dystopic imaginings, it could lead to the idea of a culling, right? That you don't think that these people belong in either place, or you want to lock them in place, all kinds of things that happen. It doesn't necessarily lead to a progressive or a humane response. That's something to think about. How will people write about Indian society in the future? I don't know. It's too big a question, but I have to say that I think that something shifted in terms of how people looked at the urban informal workforce. There is a large-scale shift in how the media, in how quote-unquote society who consumes the media looks at the urban informal workforce, and there's a large shift probably in how the urban informal workforce looks at themselves. You don't sort of walk home 1,200 kilometers in the middle of a pandemic and look at your life in the same way, nor do you look at story after story about that and think about things in the same way. But who knows how we will write about India in the future? It's too big a question.
Thank you. So next question by...
I'm sorry, I disappeared for a moment, but I have an answer.
Oh, yeah, please go ahead.
I just wanted to take a tangential route to addressing what Nikama just asked. And so I came across this very interesting bunch of essays in an issue of South Asia, Journal of South Asian Studies, which was academics from India, Pakistan, and the likes, writing about maza. So maza as an optic, maza meaning it's an Hindi Urdu word for fun and pleasure. And I think it's Nida Karmani who asks in one of the essays that why is it that while looking at South Asian women, we always use certain predetermined research frameworks? Why is it that we always ask the same set of questions? And that kind of set me thinking in a very different direction, foregrounding pleasure and fun much more in my research. And that's not entirely related to Nikhama's question, but it's one way of addressing it, that I feel in the wake of this pandemic, it has, at least as a writer and researcher, made me kind of zoom in much more on intimacy, on feelings, on affect, on emotions, on touch. So I see it as I take it as a positive opportunity to kind of train my lens on all these positive emotions much more, asking the same questions and always writing about how the suffering of South Asian women.
Thank you. I think we can go now to the last round of questions. So we have here a couple of questions from Eric Warby. For Durba, very interesting question. So he asks, what about the highway itself as a space of unexpected intimacy with strangers who are also in movement under the situations of extreme duress? And for Nandita, he also raises a very interesting question about which again raises the question of the physicality of the body. If the salon workers, they can claim specialized, racialized expertise in relation to certain types of bodies. So for example, someone who is more familiar with South Asian hair or the South Asian body, because they have the same body. So is there a situation going on? Don't clients themselves select their salons based on their presumptions about the intimate knowledge and expertise that the salons workers will have about certain types of bodies and hairs and things like that?
Who should go first? Should I take Eric's question?
No, there was a question for you.
Eric, hi, by the way. Eric and I know each other from years ago, from our days at Yale. Thank you for attending. So, the highway as a space of unexpected intimacy, and this also calls into the question, calls into question the research methodology in my case, because my fieldwork was on highways and it was conducted about a decade ago with follow-up moments. But really, it seems to not include this particular moment in a book on highways in India. It's a gap that also I don't know who will fill. So if there's not even this one chapter about what happened, which brings all of it together in some kind of sense, I don't know, just as with demonetization, which is a huge sort of thing that happened in 2016 in India, really it was a moment, it was a terrible moment in Indian economic and social life, and then it kind of disappeared, right? So I want to create some kind of document or space in my book that allows for these stories to come through. But at the same time, I haven't done primary field work. I was under lockdown conditions when all of this was taking place. And the problem with culling from journalistic sources is that you don't get these stories typically of the intimacies that took place along the highway, about what would happen when groups of strangers, so most people walked home in groups actually, not individually, when groups of strangers under extreme duress are coming together. And, as I develop and build this chapter, I look for as many sources as I can. A lot of sources have actually been Facebook sources. So I've read about and this is again the problem of who gets recorded, who you can see when you're under lockdown conditions. But there are, groups of people from more affluent elite families who basically went driving along highways as long as they could with packets of water, biscuits, food. So trying to create some kind of relief. This is separate from sort of organized NGOs who are doing a lot of relief work, including Sikh Gurdwaras and all kinds of civil society organizations that do a lot, but sort of individuals who would just get in their cars and start driving to distribute food and water. So some of those stories have not emerged as much, but there was a story that went, very popular, went viral, I think, it was one of the most popular stories in the New York Times about two friends, one young boy who died in his friend's arms on the highway during this particular exodus, and they actually knew each other before they had undertaken the journey back home. And these stories are very moving, and hopefully more of them will emerge, probably as one is able to do more interviews with people directly, which is not just about sort of how did you get home and how did you survive, but what was this journey like? What was this journey that you undertook? Those stories can and will emerge. And ideally, I hope that someone takes this up and writes a really great monograph on it, doing a lot of interviews, because it is a moment, it's a movement of millions of people more than the partition of India. It deserves space, and it shouldn't be forgotten in the same way that so much in the Indian news cycle is forgotten.
Yes, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, because I know from having spoken to clients that many of them find out about Noor's hair and beauty because the Pakistani salons in the neighborhood. Because, many of them want the things that they experienced back home, for instance, using scissors to cut hair instead of using like a trimmer, or not touching so much, which is usually the case in more professional salons. So a lot of them end up there because they're looking for that experience. But what I'm trying to say is that, because the salon is on a high street and it's in principle accessible to all, I think if you're a first-time client who's not, I don't think the space will to you as one of conviviality, one of friendship, and a very pleasant space. So that is a distinction I'm trying to kind of bring out. But how does intimacy deal with difference, or how does intimacy deal with people differently in order to reproduce that space as one of intimacy for only a specific kind of clientele?
Thank you. I think we are about to conclude, but I have a question. So I was just wondering, because since our whole project is about governing intimacies, we speak about a lot about intimacy, and in this case, I think there is a lot to say about governing as well. So my question has to do with governance, especially because we've been talking about bodies, and there is such a strong literature in anthropology and sociology about the governance of the governing bodies. A lot of this literature is very Foucauldian in nature, a lot of writing about discipline and things like that. And in this case, we have the saloon in which there is an attempt to govern on whether or not someone can touch someone else. So there is a hyper attempt at governance. And in the other case, and I wonder what Durba would think about it, it seems that there is a complete lack of concern for governance in terms of the lack of governance is itself a kind of attitude that is being taken. So I was just wondering, how can we make sense of this huge disparity in terms of scales? You don't need to reply definitely. It's just a few thoughts. Anyone can say anything?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think about the lack of concern for governance. There are two things that are happening. On the one hand, you have complete lockdown, no provisions for people who, have live in very precarious circumstances and can't survive. Like they literally don't have food to eat, or they're evicted from, the places that they were living in because by their landlords or landowners. On the other hand, you do have a certain kind of governance. So it's sort of, you will beat people at a border. You will spray them down from head to toe with, disinfect, literally, hose people down. And so you will corral them in a school, or, when there's an order that they have to be taken off the streets, you'll take populations and you'll imprison them and you'll beat some people and put them in jail. So all of that is happening at the same time that the state is abdicating any kind of welfare function, which it later picks up, to be fair. So it's sort of like there was this, 1 or 2 month period where you could see the punish of discipline and punish, right? So there was just a lot of, the kind of Damien's the regicide level punishing, right? Where the state is just a, vulgar enforcer of order. And there's video after video of sort of, police beating people. There's a viral image that went viral of the police of a particular place disinfecting their lathis in order to beat people in a safe way for violating lockdown conditions. And now if you think about this, in your societies, were people routinely beaten for violating the lockdown? Did that happen? Does that happen in the UK? Does it happen in America? Well, it does, kind of thing, but that's a separate society off on its own trip. But in South Africa, if you were violating lockdown in a group because you were destitute, could you be beaten and thrown in jail? Or could you just be beaten in public? So there's some societies where it's acceptable to discipline or to use physical punishment in public as a sort of, pedagogical, terrifying violence that people are meant to be afraid of. And that's done, quite easily, but the governmentality, the sort of, welfare function, or even the sort of, desire to police people's lives to make them live better lives, that is almost completely absent. So it's a sort of strange mix of governance and not governance, of good governance and absence, right?
I just have a very quick observation, which is that the government was indeed trying to monitor the beauty industry very, very closely. They would issue regulations almost every week saying, so these are the services that are allowed, these are not allowed. And I think women were also seeing these regulations left, right, and center. So, there is governance, and then there is the governance.
Governance and not governance, I suppose, during pandemic.
And definitely here too, Durba, what you're saying, the caring, the state as the patriarch, right, who will take a strong hand when it needs to put certain population groups in line. For sure, absolutely. And in that moment, you see precisely how the state is, absolutely racialized and classed in terms of how that paternal punitive force is directed at particular population groups and not others. But sorry to just jump in then. Kayo, I think we've actually done really well with all of our questions. I can see Eric is sharing some more commentary on the side, but we are quarter past. So in the interest of time, and we have a really fantastically generous crowd who every time we do this sticks on for a bit longer. So thank you very much. I just wanted to say that, and especially prompted by Kayo's point about governance, I think indeed the idea of, governing intimacies is, as Nandita said, I mean, the prism of intimacy in a way for me has always meant shifting that analytic gaze, right, of thinking of the global south always in terms of underdevelopment, violence, but indeed, to shift or to widen our gaze to thinking about joy and pleasure, the everyday affect, and so on and so forth. But I think where this nice coinage, which is my colleague Shireen Hasim's governing intimacies, is again warns us not to fetishize intimacy, right? Not to immediately try and romanticize what is therefore the micro or the everyday or the domestic, the private. And I think this session really draws that tension for me out of the wings a bit, and it really suggests, I mean, what you've been saying, like what about difference? What about, what the audience has said today around empathy and its limits, right? So then intimacy becomes, or governing intimacy becomes a nice analytic to think about, not just how to widen our gaze, but to make this kind of messiness also much more present. So yeah, so thank you so much. I mean, it was just really, really fantastic. And thanks to everyone who asked those really rich and really varied questions. We're going to have our next session on the 19th. Yes, Kyle? Yes, the 19th. And we're going to have Sisonke Semang and Sarah Nuttall, who are both, going to speak about, I want to say they're both from South Africa, but Sisonke is actually going to come in from Australia. But the session is going to be called Women Writing. So, and we'll share details in another week, 10 days. So yeah, I look forward to seeing many of you there. And thank you so much to both Nandita and Durba. It was a real pleasure to hear about your research you're on. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much, Nandita, Srila, Kayo, and everyone for the questions. I'm going to try and screenshot some of them before I leave. So.
Yes, there's still some comments on the chat, so do have a look. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.